Joining us now, we're honored to have, as always, Chase Untermeyer, former ambassador under George Bush to the state of Qatar, long time in the federal government in various number of positions. He's also a graduate of Harvard University and the author of many books, one of the best being When Things Were Right, about the Reagan-Bush administration, Inside Reagan's Navy, and How Important People Act, among others. And he's joining us now, Chase Untermeyer, and he was actually the founder of the U.S. Qatar America Institute. He's with us now. Mr. Ambassador, great to have you with us.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
So, Mr. Ambassador, let's get to Iran. So the Iranians yesterday say, well, we're going to exceed the levels of the JCPOA agreement on uranium because, well, the U.S. canceled the agreement. They're no longer in it, so we're not bound by that, so we can do whatever we want because the deal's gone. And now we're upset over it. And the Europeans, I don't know what they're going to do. They're still in the deal. What do you make of this, sir?
Well, it's part of Iran's long-term aim to have nuclear weapons. I've felt all along that it really didn't matter what the government of Iran is or how friendly they are to us. They view themselves as a historical power in that part of the world. They look across and they see dinky little North Korea having nuclear weapons, and not that it's our policy yet, but we seem to be edging in the direction of accepting that fact. And Iran makes the logical conclusion, if North Korea can get a presidential visit and all this attention, what if we get nuclear weapons too? So it just seemed to me a matter of time before they abandoned their own so-called or self-said restraint in not enriching uranium so they could move toward getting weapons. So they're going to get weapons one of these days, regardless of what we or the Europeans do.
So how should we handle this? I mean, we pulled out of the deal, right? So as soon as we pulled out, and I was in favor of pulling out of the deal because I didn't think it was a good opportunity for us, and I thought it was the wrong way to go about it. But part of the consequences of pulling out is, as far as the United States is concerned, Iranian restrictions were no longer on the table because we canceled it. So then they can do whatever they want, right? But now the Europeans have to react to this, and they're all in a tizzy over it. How should the U.S. react to this, Mr. Ambassador?
Our options have always been limited. We certainly had the opportunity 10 years ago or longer, either we or the Israelis, to try to attack those facilities and remove them as the Israelis did the Syrian nuclear program back about 12 years ago. But we held back from that for whatever reason, I don't know. I wasn't in government at that time. But that's about the only thing I can imagine that would restrain the Iranians from taking these steps toward getting weapons. We have tried sanctions. Sanctions have hurt Iran, but like any dictatorship, the Iranians are going to put their money where their hearts are, and their hearts are in military power and nuclear weapons. That's what the North Koreans and the Russians and the Venezuelans and all the other countries that are broke to do with their money. They put it into what will preserve the regime.
So their regime has survived. I mean, if you go back to the overthrow of the Shah and you go back to Jimmy Carter and the Iranian hostage crisis, I mean, they've had sanctions put on them by the U.S. over and over for the last, 53 years. Their regime, the Persian, their civilization, they've managed to survive. I remember interviewing their foreign minister, and I asked him that question when I was in the Doha Forum. There was a number of reporters that had access to him, and we had a little round table. There was 10 of us. That was a question that I asked is, how would they survive the sanctions, and how could their regime survive with young people's unemployment at 13%? They were running out of water, economic chaos was coming. And he laughed. And he said, that's a typical U.S. Western media question. We have survived for 1,000 years. We will survive whatever stupid sanctions you put on us. We are a resilient people. I never forgot that answer. And that was only about 8, 9, 10 months ago when we were there. And it was like, okay, they don't really care what we do. They don't care if their people suffer. So if you were giving advice to President Trump right now, Mr. Ambassador, what would it be?
There's very little in the way of options. I'd say some kind of diplomatic engagement. The value of diplomatic engagement is not that it gets you any result that you necessarily want, but at least you learn a little bit more about your opponent. And we haven't had that much direct contact, certainly not in this administration, with the Iranian regime. So some kind of discussions in some place or another could be helpful, useful. But as I said, the Iranians look across the globe and they see that North Korea seems to be getting a lot of high-level attention and even love by having nuclear weapons. So the conclusion for the Iranians is pretty simple. Let's get our own nukes, and they'll pay more attention to us in the way we want.
Mr. Ambassador, do you think, in view of what you just said, that it was a mistake for President Trump to go to North Korea on short notice and give that level of attention and legitimacy to Kim Jong-un?
Well, I quote that great political philosopher Mae West, who said, when I'm faced with a choice between two evils, I always choose the evil I've never tried before. So, in the case of dealing with North Korea, we tried every kind of way, being tough, having negotiations, having sanctions, relieving sanctions, and nothing seemed to work. President Trump's very unique and an energetic form of diplomacy at least gets the attention of the North Koreans in a way that we haven't in the past. Now, the results will show whether or not that was successful, but at least it was something new. And maybe we need to think that way in Iran as well.
Well, we pulled out of the deal, right? So a lot of people said that the vice president who was going to New Hampshire yesterday for an opioid remarks turned around, went back to D.C., no event scheduled for the president yesterday in D.C. Some people saying that was a result of U.S. intel finding out that the Iranians had decided to abandon their restrictions on uranium enrichment. But we pulled out of the deal. So I guess what I'm having a hard time understanding is one of the consequences of pulling out of the deal was that they have no restrictions on them for uranium enrichment as it relates to the United States. So we're already doing sanctions, which is really damaging their economy. So,
it was always up to them, after all, as to whether they were going to abide by this agreement. As I've indicated, I think their intention is pretty clear to move toward nuclear weapons, and perhaps they were doing secret work all along during the time that they told us that they were living up to the agreement. I don't know. So it was always a matter of just whether you trusted the Iranians to say that they were abiding by an agreement, whether or not anybody else abided by it. So the fact they've abandoned it is not a great surprise. And with regard to sanctions, sometimes they work, but most of the time they don't. If sanctions really worked, Cuba would have become a democratic and free country decades ago. But once again, a dictatorship will take whatever kind of money or income it has and put it behind keeping itself in power. And therefore, we're on whatever we are, the 60th anniversary of having communism in Cuba.
You look at this, and the Europeans have to decide what to do. And, of course, our sanctions with European companies are now, they have to make a decision because it's hurting. I mean, they like to continue to trade and do business with Iran because they can make more money. They have a lot of people they can serve through their companies, but then they get the boomerang sanctions with the U.S. So this is really hurting the Iranian economy. And so you're right. I mean, it leaves them no choice but to go and rattle their own nuclear sabers, especially when they look around and so many other countries in the Middle East has it. Let's get to the president's G20 meeting last week. I have to give my bias here. I was appalled that he was lavishing praise on Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. I don't know why he had to do that. The guy just murdered Khashoggi, lied to the president on the bat phone. What was the purpose of that? I just, for the life of me, I couldn't wait to our phone call because I was hoping that you could help me understand why the president did that.
I don't know Donald Trump, and therefore I can only analyze him from afar, but he seems to be a man who believes in sticking with his friends. And his friends may be kind of dodgy, But as long as they are friends and return that friendship, he sticks by them. And the Trump administration Saudi Arabia friendship began pretty early, as we remember. Saudi Arabia was the very first foreign country that Donald Trump visited as president. Normally, presidents go to Canada, Mexico, Western Europe. He went to Saudi Arabia, and that's where the bromance began, and it has continued. It's one of the reasons why it seems to me that the United States, while it knows that this blockade that's been going on in the Gulf for 2 years is doing no good, is certainly not helping the common front against Iran, nevertheless, we're not prepared, apparently, to lean on our friend to get them to stop it.
Well, it's an absurd blockade because it's accomplished no objectives except divide the GCC states and isolate one of our biggest allies, Qatar, that has the biggest air base there, that is basically the linchpin, as you know, of our entire military operations throughout the Middle East. I mean, that's the base for Afghanistan and everything else. So this whole thing makes no sense. So let's get to the visit by the Emir coming up next week of Qatar. Is going to be his third one. By the way, we're with Ambassador Chase Untermeyer, former ambassador to Qatar under the George W. Bush administration, and Chase Untermeyer also now he's the founding chairman of the Qatar America Institute, which aims to really increase the understanding of the two countries. Also Harvard graduate and the author of many books. One of my favorites that I read being When Things Were Right, about the George H. Bush Reagan administration. So, Mr. Ambassador, the Emir of Qatar coming to the White House for the third time. He's coming next week. I think he's there July 9th or 10th, if memory serves me. And the blockade, going into its third year, has accomplished absolutely nothing for Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, and the UAE. They have zero gain out of it. And it seems like the president, who at first we understand kind of went with it and went with some of his advisors, now has looked at this whole thing and he's changed his position on Qatar. That's obvious. I mean, his rhetoric is toned down, and he seems to be looking for a way out of this blockade to put the GCC back together. What do you look for in this summit with the Emir on July 9th?
John, before I answer that, let me just say that our entire conversation here is you're speaking to me in my capacity as a former ambassador. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Qatar American Institute, which is not engaged in advocacy or lobbying or any other kind of thing other than educational and cultural matters. I just wanted to make that clear.
Yes,
but happily speaking in my former role, I can say that the visit of the Emir of Qatar to the White House is very positive. I hope that it will create a friendship and an understanding between our president and the Emir of a way that can only help move us toward a more active role in sorting out this blockade. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the people who have done the blockade. And I have to say that the blockade's been a great failure. Qatar is not only still standing strong, but it is able to now feed itself and take care of all kinds of needs that the blockade was supposed to turn off. So in such an atmosphere where it frankly would be embarrassing for the Saudis and the Emiratis to end the blockade in a note of failure, perhaps the president, because he has good ties with those two countries, can work out some kind of mutual step down that will end the blockade.
Or at least end the only real result that the blockade is having been in the Middle East now several times and talked to a lot of people, it's a humanitarian problem because there's no free movement of people between the countries as there was in the past. So if you've got family there, or you got an uncle there or something, students that were in Doha can't go back and forth. So there's a humanitarian issue. But as far as any of the economic impacts on the state of Qatar that the embargo, the blockade, was designed to have, they've all backfired. I mean, you look at Qatar's GDP, it's up. I mean, every economic indicator they have, they're actually better off than they were before the blockade. So that doesn't make any sense. So all it's done is divided the GCC for no reason. But like you say, now the Saudis and UAE, they have to say face. How do they do this? How do they wind this thing down?
If the United States is willing to not just pressure Saudi Arabia, but just be firm, as friends can be firm with their friends, and say, we've got to end this. It's not helping the common front against Iran. It is not helping the cooperation of these countries in the face of terrorism. So many things are being done that are negative to our relationship. Therefore, it is in the interest of our relationship, the U.S.-Saudi relationship, for this to come to an end. And how do we do this in a way that will help you save face, will not make you feel as if you have lost, even though you have lost?
Well, I wish you were there giving advice to some of these people, because I think it would be very sage, and you probably could help them navigate a way out of it. If you were to give advice to the president right now on ending this rift, because again, I mean, our biggest air base is there. It's very strategically important, everything we do. If the president were to call you up and say, "Hey, Mr. Ambassador, you know, you've been there, done that. How do I get this solved?" What would you tell him, sir?
I would recommend what I hope he's going to do first on his own, and that is to ask the Emir of Qatar for his advice, just from the point of view of somebody who's in the neighborhood. What would it take? And from a cultural point of view, from an Arab pride point of view, what would it take for your neighbors to stop this blockade, step back, withdraw, whatever kind of verb we want to use? And Sheikh Tamim, the emir, is very candid. That's the nature of the Qatari people, is to be candid, and I think he'll give a good answer. I can only speculate on what that answer is, but I imagine that would be the most valuable product of their conversation next week.
So, final question, Mr. Ambassador. You were there as ambassador to Qatar at a very critical time during the George W. Bush administration, 2005 to 2009?
2004, 2007.
2004 to 2007. All right, I was in the right. I was in the right range. There's still a lot of people, and I'm going to call them the neocons, running around DC. You know who they are as well as I do, and a lot of them still saying that Qatar is involved in underhanded funding of terrorism around the Middle East. Now, you were there as ambassador for some time at a very critical time. Did you find any evidence of that?
No, not in my time, but let's bring it up to the modern time. You won't find a better testifier in favor of Qatar's compliance with all kinds of terrorist finance restrictions than Stephen Mnuchin. He's been very forthright in praising Qatar for its compliance with everything the U.S. government has asked in order to cut off any support for terrorist groups. And what we're talking about, incidentally, is by no means government support for terrorist groups, but individuals who are persuaded that it somehow fulfills their religious obligation if they give money to these individuals. And so that's where the problem lies.
Final thing, I got to go. Did the president do the right thing in not going forward with dropping bombs on Iran 2 weeks ago?
I think he did absolutely the right thing. Praise his restraint, and it gives heart that if there are elements inside his own administration pressing for war, that Donald Trump realizes that nobody, no one in this country or any other country, wants war.
Do you mind if I tell people to buy When Things Went Right? You can get it on Amazon by Chase Untermeyer.
And some other wonderful books, too.
It is a wonderful book. I mean, you got a bunch of them, but I read that, I laughed, and it's a great trek down memory lane. When Things Went Right, Chase Untermeyer, the beginning of the George H. Bush and Reagan administration, 1980, what it was like to be in D.C. then. I remember it, just a fun time. Mr. Ambassador, I always love your insight. Thank you for being with us, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, John, thank you so much, and have a happy 4th.
Happy 4th, too. John Fredericks Radio Network. Stay with us.